The story of Rome is usually told as a relentless march to glory. It's a tale of disciplined soldiers and brilliant engineers who forged one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. From the foggy hills of Britain to the deserts of Syria, the Roman eagle cast a long shadow. But this idea of Roman invincibility is incomplete. It conveniently forgets the times when Rome wasn't the predator, but the prey. Times when the supposedly unbreakable legions were shattered, when Roman generals were outthought and outfought, and when the Senate itself felt the cold grip of fear. And where did this challenge often come from? Not from the forests of Germany or the vast plains of Parthia, but from the continent to its south, Africa. Long before the Roman Empire hit its peak, powerful and sophisticated civilizations thrived in Africa, with rich cultures, huge wealth, and formidable armies. They weren't just footnotes in Rome's story. They were heroes in their own right. And more than once, they stood toe-to-toe with the Mediterranean superpower and refused to blink. We're going to explore how Carthage, Kush, and Numidia directly challenged the legions and made the Eternal City very, very nervous. These weren't minor border skirmishes. These were existential threats, wars that pushed Rome to the brink, led by brilliant commanders who became nightmares for the Roman people. They forced Rome to adapt, to innovate, and to respect the power that lay just across the sea. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on these incredible stories of resistance. We'll start with Rome's greatest rival, a superpower that nearly brought the Republic to its knees. Then, we'll travel south along the Nile, to a kingdom ruled by a warrior queen who took on the personal might of Emperor Augustus himself. And finally, we'll head to a kingdom of legendary horsemen, an ally who became a bitter enemy and taught Rome a painful lesson in guerrilla warfare and betrayal. Imagine a city so wealthy its coffers overflowed with the silver of distant lands. Imagine a port so ingenious it could hide a war fleet of over 200 ships from the prying eyes of the outside world, ready to emerge at a moment's notice. This wasn't some backwater kingdom. This was a sophisticated urban center with a thriving merchant class, advanced public works, and a navy that was the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians didn't seek to conquer the world, but to trade with it, to control its resources, and to grow rich from the currents of commerce they themselves directed. This was an African empire built by savvy merchants and daring sailors, a stark contrast to the European, land-hungry republic taking shape across the sea in Italy. The conflict that was to come wasn't just a clash of armies, but a clash of two fundamentally different visions of empire, of power, and of the world itself. To understand this conflict and the tragedy of what was lost, we have to go back to the beginning, to a princess, a betrayal, and a clever bargain that founded a great African city destined for greatness. The story of Carthage begins, as so many great legends do, with an ending. It starts not in Africa, but hundreds of miles to the east, in the magnificent Phoenician city-state of Tyre, in modern-day Lebanon. The Phoenicians were the ancient world's great seafarers, a people who saw the Mediterranean not as a barrier, but as a highway. They were traders, explorers, and colonists, establishing outposts all across the sea. As the story goes, in the 9th century BCE, the king of Tyre died, leaving his kingdom to his two children, an ambitious young son named Pygmalion, and a daughter known to history as Alyssa. Alyssa was married to the high priest, a man of immense wealth and influence. Pygmalion, consumed by greed, saw his brother-in-law not as family, but as a rival. In a shocking act of sacrilege, he had the high priest murdered, hoping to seize his vast fortune. Alyssa, now a widow in a court ruled by her husband's killer, knew her life was in danger, but she was no damsel in distress. According to the legend, she orchestrated a masterful escape. Pretending to prepare to move into Pygmalion's palace, she had his servants load her murdered husband's treasures onto ships, supposedly as a gift for the king. But also aboard those ships were loyal nobles who despised Pygmalion's tyranny. Under the cover of darkness, they set sail, leaving the grasping king with nothing but empty docks. Alyssa, the grieving widow, had become a leader of exiles. From then on, she would be known by a new name, one that meant the wanderer, Dido. Dido and her followers sailed west, searching for a place to build a new home, a new Tyre. After a stop in Cyprus, they landed on the coast of North Africa, in what is today modern Tunisia. The location was perfect, a peninsula jutting out into the sea, with natural harbors and a commanding view of the strait between Africa and Sicily, a vital choke point for all maritime traffic. But the land belonged to the local Libyan tribes, ruled by a king named Iorbus. Dido entered into negotiations. Iorbus, perhaps amused by these foreigners, agreed to sell them a piece of land, but with a seemingly mocking condition. They could have only as much land as could be encompassed by a single ox hide. It was meant to be an insult, but Iorbus had severely underestimated the woman he was dealing with. Dido, demonstrating the cunning that would become her city's hallmark, accepted the deal. She then had the ox hide cut into incredibly fine strips. By laying these strips end to end, she created a line long enough to encircle an entire prominent hill overlooking the sea. Iorbus, bound by his word, had been outsmarted. On that hill, which would forever be known as the Bursa, the hide, the foundations of a new African city were laid. They called it Carthage, Phoenician for new city. The Romans would later Latinize this name into Carthago. Carthage was born. This founding legend, whether literally true or not, perfectly captures the spirit of the civilization it spawned. A power built not on brute force, but on intelligence, commercial acumen, and turning limitations into strategic advantages. From its cleverly acquired beginnings on the Bursa Hill, the new African city grew at an astonishing pace. Its location was a stroke of strategic genius. Situated on the Gulf of Tunis, Carthage was perfectly positioned to dominate the east-west trade routes of the Mediterranean. Ships sailing from the Levant and Greece to Spain had to pass through the narrow channel between Sicily and the African coast, right under the watchful eye of the Carthaginian state. It was the gatekeeper of the western seas, and it would soon charge a toll. But the true marvel of Carthage, the physical embodiment of its power and secrecy, lay in its harbor. The Carthaginians didn't just use a natural bay. They engineered one of the most sophisticated port complexes in the ancient world, a masterpiece known as the Thorn. It was a double harbor, hidden from the open sea by an entrance that could be closed with iron chains. An arriving merchant ship would first enter a large rectangular commercial port, a bustling basin filled with traders from across the known world, haggling over spices, cedarwood, metals, textiles, wine, and oil. But beyond this public space, accessible only through a guarded channel, lay the heart of Carthaginian power, the secret military harbor. This inner port was perfectly circular. According to the historian Appian, its perimeter contained 220 individual ship sheds, dry docks where Carthage's mighty navy could be built and maintained, hidden from spies. Each dock was fronted by two towering columns, giving the complex the appearance of a grand portico. At the very center was a man-made island where the admiral's headquarters stood, allowing the commander to observe the entire fleet and see out to sea, while the base itself remained concealed from outside view. It was a fortress of naval secrecy, allowing Carthage to mask its military preparations. This harbor was the symbol of Carthage. While Rome built roads to project its power across land, Carthage built a port to project its power across the sea. From this port, its influence spread. Carthaginian merchants established a network of colonies from North Africa to Sicily, Sardinia, and all along the coast of the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain. Their focus wasn't on conquering and assimilating vast populations as Rome later would. Theirs was primarily a commercial empire. They sought control of resources, especially the silver mines of Iberia that would finance their fleets. Carthaginian sailors controlled the flow of tin, essential for making bronze, and may have even traveled as far as the fog-shrouded shores of Britain, the mythical Tin Islands, to secure it. Though the full extent of these northern voyages remains debated, the city itself became fabulously wealthy, a cosmopolitan metropolis, home to people from across the Mediterranean world. It boasted temples, theaters, markets, and advanced public infrastructure. Its ruling class was not a hereditary aristocracy of landowners, but an oligarchy of wealthy merchant families, whose power was tied to the success of their commercial ventures. For them, the balance sheet was as important as the battlefield. This focus on trade and naval power made Carthage a maritime empire, a thalassocracy, and for centuries, it was a dominant force in its region. Carthage's economic dominance was built and maintained by the most formidable naval force in the western Mediterranean. For a long time, to sail those waters was to sail in a Carthaginian sphere of influence. Their supremacy was based on superior ships, unmatched seafaring skill, and a ruthless policy of protecting their commercial interests. The workhorse of their fleet was the Cavalry, a powerful warship designed for ramming and sinking enemy ships. Carthage could field hundreds of these vessels, crewed by the world's best sailors, heirs to a Phoenician tradition of navigation that was centuries old. They were said to possess secret knowledge of the winds and currents, guarding their trade routes as state secrets. This naval power wasn't just for show. Carthage enforced its maritime jurisdiction with brutal efficiency. Any foreign vessel that sailed into waters, Carthage considered its own risk being sunk without warning. The historian Strabo tells of a Carthaginian captain who, followed by a Roman ship trying to discover his trade route, deliberately ran his own ship aground to lead the Romans to their doom. Upon returning home, the state reimbursed him for the lost cargo from the public treasury. It was the cost of maintaining a monopoly. They used their navy to suppress piracy, an act that, while a public good, also conveniently eliminated independent maritime rivals. They established colonies at strategic choke points, not just for trade, but as naval bases from which they could project power and fight to keep other powers, especially ambitious Greek city-states, out of their sphere of influence. This model of empire was profoundly different from the one developing in Italy. Rome was a terrestrial power. Its strength was its legions. Roman power was built on territory, agriculture, and citizen soldiers. Carthaginian power was built on networks, trade, and sea power. They relied heavily on mercenaries, hiring soldiers from the powerful African peoples like the Libyans and Numidians, alongside Iberians and Gauls, to fight their land wars, preferring to keep their own citizens in the lucrative business of trade or the essential service of the navy. For a long time, these two worlds could coexist. Rome was busy consolidating control of the Italian peninsula, while Carthage managed its vast commercial network. They even had treaties defining their spheres of influence. But this peace was fragile. As Rome's power pushed south, its gaze inevitably fell upon the island that lay just a stone's throw away, Sicily. Sicily was the jewel of the Mediterranean, a breadbasket and a strategic crossroads, a patchwork of Greek cities and Carthaginian colonies. It was here, on this island coveted by all, that the land-based empire and the sea-based empire were about to collide. The year is 264 BC. Rome has consolidated its control over most of the Italian peninsula. It now stands as the master of Italy, a republic forged in constant warfare, possessing the most formidable land army in the world. But as the Romans look south, they see Sicily. At the same time, Carthage is near the zenith of its power. Its commercial empire is a well-oiled machine, and its navy patrols the seas. Western Sicily is firmly within its grasp. The fuse that would ignite the greatest conflict the ancient world had yet seen was lit by a small group of mercenaries, a band of Italian soldiers of fortune. The Mamertines, or Sons of Mars, had seized the strategic city of Messana on the Sicilian side of the strait, separating the island from Italy. From there, they acted as pirates, terrorizing the region. Their disruptive activities eventually drew the attention of Hiero, the ruler of the powerful Greek city of Syracuse, who decided to put a stop to them and besieged Messana. Facing annihilation, the desperate Mamertines sent appeals for help to the two powers capable of intervening, Carthage and Rome. It was a fateful decision that would force both republics to show their hands. Carthage responded first, always keen to expand its influence in Sicily. A Carthaginian commander convinced the Mamertines to allow a garrison of Punic troops into the city. From Carthage's perspective, this was a low-cost move to gain control of a vital port. Messana was now theirs. But the Mamertines, wary of becoming a Carthaginian puppet, also sent an embassy to Rome. This presented the Roman Senate with a terrible dilemma. To help the Mamertines meant war with Carthage, a naval power whose strength was legendary. It meant fighting overseas for the first time. What's more, the Mamertines were little more than thugs, and for the law and order Romans, allying with them felt deeply hypocritical. But to refuse the appeal was unthinkable. An African superpower controlling Messana would control the strait. They could strangle the trade of Rome's allies in southern Italy. A fully Carthaginian-controlled Sicily would be a dagger pointed at the heart of the young Roman Republic. The debate in the Senate was fierce, but in the end, fear of Carthage outweighed any reservations. The Roman assembly voted for war. A Roman army was dispatched to Sicily, and they ejected the Carthaginian garrison from Messana. The gauntlet had been thrown down. Carthage, outraged at this direct challenge, declared war. The First Punic War had begun. Neither side truly understood what they were getting into. The Romans thought it would be a quick land campaign, the type of war they knew well. The Carthaginians assumed their navy would quickly bring these landlubbers to heel. Both were catastrophically wrong. They had stumbled into a brutal war of attrition that would last for over 2 decades, a meat grinder that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives and fundamentally change both republics forever. The First Punic War was a clash of titans, the elephant and the whale. Rome, the elephant, was unmatched on land, its legions quickly gaining the upper hand in Sicily. But Carthage, the whale, was master of the sea. Its navy could resupply its besieged cities at will, while raiding the Italian coast. The Romans quickly realized a painful truth. They couldn't win the war without challenging Carthage on the water. This was a terrifying prospect. Rome had no real navy, but the Romans possessed a genius for practical innovation and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. If they didn't have a navy, they would build one. As the historian Polybius tells it, they got a lucky break. A Carthaginian quinquereme ran aground on the Italian coast and was captured, using this ship as a blueprint. Roman engineers reverse-engineered the design in what Polybius describes as a breathtaking feat of production. They constructed a fleet of over 100 warships in just 2 months, a timeline modern historians often find remarkable. But building ships was one thing. Fighting with them was another. Knowing their crews were no match for the skilled Carthaginians in traditional ramming combat, the Romans changed the rules of the game. They deployed a device that would turn a sea battle into a land battle, the corvus, or crow. The corvus was a heavy boarding bridge with a pointed spike at the end. When an enemy ship drew near, the Romans would swing the bridge over and drop it onto the enemy's deck, the spike biting deep into the planking and locking the 2 ships together. Then, Roman legionaries would pour across, turning a naval engagement into the close-quarters combat they excelled at. The corvus was unveiled at the Battle of Mylae in 2060 BCE, and it was a stunning success. The confident Carthaginian fleet was utterly unprepared. One by one, their ships were grappled, boarded, and captured. It was a humiliating defeat for the masters of the sea. Rome had its first major naval victory. The war raged on for 2 more decades. The Romans even attempted a daring but disastrous invasion of North Africa. The corvus, for all its success, proved a liability in rough seas, its weight making ships unstable, and entire fleets were lost to storms. Ultimately, the war came down to resources and willpower. Carthage, a commercial state, was wary of the war's escalating costs. Rome, a republic of citizen soldiers, was willing to throw everything it had into the conflict. In 241 BCE, at the Battle of the Agatis Islands, a newly built Roman fleet finally defeated the last major Carthaginian navy. Carthage, exhausted and its coffers empty, sued for peace. The terms were crushing. They were forced to abandon Sicily and pay a massive indemnity to Rome. The humiliation was compounded by what happened next. Unable to pay its vast mercenary army, Carthage was plunged into a new brutal conflict known as the Mercenary War, which brought the city to the brink of destruction. It was during this desperate struggle that a new figure emerged, Hannibal Barca, a brilliant general who ruthlessly crushed the revolt. But Hamilcar never forgot the humiliation by Rome. He looked to Spain as a new base to rebuild Carthaginian power, nursing a bitter hatred for the republic that had brought his city so low, a hatred he would pass on to his son. Rincuxis in the aftermath of the First Punic War, Carthage was a shadow of its former self. It had lost Sicily, its navy was crippled, and its treasury was drained. Worse still, Rome, in an act of cynical opportunism, took advantage of Carthage's weakness during the Mercenary War to seize Sardinia and Corsica as well, a violation of the peace treaty and a deep insult the Carthaginians were powerless to prevent. From this despair, one man, Hannibal Barca, conceived of a bold new strategy. He saw that the future lay not in the central Mediterranean, but in Iberia. The Spanish peninsula was rich in silver mines that could refill Carthage's coffers and pay for new armies of fierce local warriors. Hamilcar planned to carve out a new Carthaginian empire in Spain, a power base from which their African-based empire could one day challenge Rome again. The story goes that before setting out for Spain, Hamilcar took his young son Hannibal, then only 9 years old, to a temple. There, he made the boy place his hand on the sacrifice and swear an oath that he would never be a friend to the Roman people. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, the oath of eternal enmity became his life's mission. For nearly a decade, Hamilcar expanded Carthaginian territory in Spain. When he died, command eventually passed, in 21 BCE, to the man raised for this very purpose, Hannibal Barca. Now 26, Hannibal was the product of a military upbringing, possessing his father's strategic genius and a charisma all his own. He was a brilliant leader who inspired fierce loyalty in his multicultural mercenary army. His soldiers, drawn from Africa, Spain, and Gaul, fought not for Carthage, but for Hannibal. He spent his first years consolidating Carthaginian power in Spain. Rome watched this resurgence with anxiety. A treaty had been established with Hannibal's predecessor, Hasdrubal the Fair, designating the Ebro River in northern Spain as the limit of Carthaginian expansion. The flashpoint came at the city of Saguntum. Located south of the Ebro, it was technically in the Carthaginian sphere, but had recently signed an alliance with Rome. When a dispute broke out, Hannibal laid siege to the city, knowing it was a direct challenge to Roman honor and a clear cause for war. Rome demanded that Carthage hand Hannibal over. The Carthaginian Senate, emboldened by the new wealth from Spain, refused. A Roman envoy in their Senate held up 2 folds of his toga. "In this fold," he declared, "I bring you peace. In this one, I bring you war. Choose." The Carthaginians shouted back, "Choose yourself." The envoy dropped the fold of war. The Second Punic War was on, but Hannibal had no intention of fighting a defensive war. He would do the unthinkable. He would take the war to them, into the heart of Italy itself. His plan was one of the most audacious in history. He would march his army, including his famous war elephants, over the snow-covered peaks of the Alps. Hannibal's plan was a masterpiece of strategic surprise. The Romans expected the war to be fought in Spain and at sea, never imagining a major army could reach their front door from the north. In 218 BCE, Hannibal set out from Spain with a force ancient sources estimate at nearly 100,000 men and several dozen war elephants. The crossing of the Alps is one of history's great epics of human endurance. Hannibal's army faced blizzards, avalanches, and constant attacks from hostile mountain tribes. Men and animals slipped on icy paths and plunged into the chasms below. After 15 days of unimaginable hardship, he had succeeded, but the cost was staggering. His army was reduced to perhaps just 26,000 men. Isolated and weakened, he faced a shocked Roman Republic, confident they could crush this battered force. The Romans hastily recalled their legions. They were wrong. At the Battle of the Trebia River, and then again at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal inflicted 2 devastating defeats on the Romans, using clever ambushes and brilliant maneuvers to outwit them. In just a few months, he had destroyed 2 Roman armies and thrown the Republic into a panic. Rome appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus dictator. Fabius understood he couldn't beat Hannibal in a pitched battle. Instead, he adopted a strategy of attrition that earned him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. He shadowed Hannibal's army, refusing a major battle, instead launching small raids to wear them down. This Fabian strategy was militarily sound, but politically unpopular. The Romans saw it as cowardly and craved a decisive victory. In 2116 BCE, they got their wish. 2 new consuls were given command of the largest army Rome had ever assembled, a force of some 86,000 men. They marched to confront Hannibal, who was outnumbered almost 2 to 1, near a town called Cannae. On a flat plain perfect for his superior cavalry, Hannibal arranged his weakest troops in a thin, bulging crescent in the center. As the massive Roman legion surged forward, the crescent deliberately inverted, drawing the Romans deeper into a trap. Meanwhile, Hannibal's cavalry shattered their Roman counterparts and circled to the rear. The trap was sprung. Hannibal's elite African infantry turned inward, smashing the Roman flanks while the cavalry closed in from behind. The Roman army was completely surrounded. What followed was a slaughter. Trapped and unable to fight effectively, the Roman soldiers were cut down by the thousands. By the end of the day, ancient sources claim as many as 50,000 Romans lay dead, including one consul and 80 senators. Hannibal had lost perhaps 6,000 men. It was the single worst defeat in Roman history. Rome was on its knees, its survival in question, but Hannibal hesitated, lacking the equipment for a siege of the city itself, and hoping they would sue for peace. It was his greatest miscalculation. The Romans did not break. They refused to negotiate. They levied new legions, recruiting boys and even slaves, and returned to the Fabian strategy. The war in Italy became a stalemate. Hannibal could not be defeated, but he could not win the war. The decisive action shifted elsewhere. A brilliant young Roman general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, took command in Spain and, using tactics inspired by Hannibal himself, drove the Carthaginians out. Then, Scipio took the war to Africa. The Carthaginian Senate recalled Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. In 2020 BCE, on the plains of Zama, the two greatest generals of the age finally met. This time, Scipio had the superior cavalry. He studied Hannibal's tactics and devised countermeasures. At Zama, Hannibal suffered his first and only major defeat. The Second Punic War was over. Scipio would be forever known as Scipio Africanus. The peace terms imposed after Zama were designed to end Carthage as a great power. The empire was stripped of all its overseas territories. Its navy was reduced to just 10 ships, according to most sources. It was forbidden from waging war without Rome's permission, and it was forced to pay another staggering indemnity to ensure Carthage remained weak. Rome's treaty empowered its new Numidian ally, King Massinissa, on Carthage's border, who proceeded to encroach on Carthaginian land. Hannibal was driven into exile, hunted by the Romans for the rest of his life, until he finally took his own, a tragic end for the man who made Rome tremble. Yet, a strange thing happened. Freed from the immense expense of a military, Carthage focused once again on what it did best: trade. In the decades that followed, the city experienced a remarkable economic recovery, so prosperous in fact, that it offered to pay off its war indemnity early. This astonishing recovery sparked not admiration in Rome, but paranoia. A faction led by a staunch conservative named Cato the Elder saw Carthage's new wealth as an existential threat. After a visit to the thriving city, Cato became obsessed with its destruction. As the story is told, he ended every speech in the Senate, no matter the topic, with the same chilling phrase, Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I believe that Carthage must be destroyed. In a famous anecdote, he held up a fresh fig, claiming it was picked in Carthage just 3 days earlier, a dramatic demonstration of how close and dangerous this rival was. The pretext for the final act came from the Numidians. After years of unchecked land grabs, around 150 BCE, Carthage had had enough. They raised an army and counterattacked, a direct violation of the peace treaty. This was the excuse Rome had been waiting for. They declared war. The Third Punic War had begun. This time, it was an execution. The Carthaginians, knowing they stood no chance, tried to appease Rome. They surrendered their weapons and armor. But the final Roman ultimatum was a death sentence: abandon their city, which was to be burned to the ground. They could rebuild, but it had to be at least 10 miles from the sea. For a civilization built on the sea, this was a demand they could not accept. The disarmed citizens chose to fight. For 3 years, in one of history's most heroic last stands, the city held out. The women cut off their hair to be braided into catapult ropes. Gold and silver were melted down for weapons. The final assault was led by Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of the man who defeated Hannibal. In 1406 BCE, his legions breached the walls. For 6 days, they fought house by house, slaughtering the inhabitants. The last defenders died in a burning temple on the Bursa, the very hill where the city was founded. The roughly 50,000 survivors, out of a pre-siege population estimated in the hundreds of thousands, were sold into slavery. The Roman Senate decreed the city be systematically demolished. The story that they then sowed the land with salt is a powerful myth, but a later invention. They didn't need to. The destruction was absolute. The story of Carthage is a powerful reminder of how entire civilizations can be wiped from the historical record, their stories told only by their conquerors. But Carthage wasn't the only African power to give Rome nightmares. As the Roman Republic morphed into an empire and its eagles flew east to claim Egypt, they came face to face with another ancient and proud kingdom. For our next story, we travel south down the Nile to the land of Kush, where a warrior queen rose up to hand Emperor Augustus one of his most humbling setbacks. To really get the scale of this showdown, we need to picture the world in the late 1st century BC, and that world was dominated by one terrifying superpower. After the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus, was the undisputed master of the Roman world. The civil wars were over. Rome was united, and its power was absolute. The Mediterranean wasn't just a sea, it was Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Roman eagle cast a shadow that stretched across 3 continents. This was an empire of 50 million people, held together by the iron grip of the legions. The Roman army was the most sophisticated, disciplined fighting force on the planet. These guys were professionals, trained to march, build, and fight with terrifying efficiency. In 30 BC, this machine rolled up to its final great prize, Egypt. After the suicide of Cleopatra, Egypt's independence was snuffed out. It became a Roman province, and not just any province. Egypt was the personal property of the emperor himself, the breadbasket of the empire. For Augustus, this was the crowning achievement of his victory. So big he put it on coins that read Aegypto capta, Egypt captured, with Egypt under their belt. The Romans stood at a new frontier, looking south past the first cataract of the Nile. They saw a region they called Nubia. To the Romans, this was just another piece of territory ripe for the taking. It was a land of gold, ivory, and exotic goods, another frontier to be pacified and taxed. They figured their advance south would be as easy and inevitable as the sunrise. They were wrong, because south of that border lay a civilization with its own ancient roots, the Kingdom of Kush. Now, a lot of early colonial-era scholarship dismissed Kush as a cheap copy of Egypt. That couldn't be more wrong. Kush was a major African power in its own right, centered in modern-day Sudan. Kush and Egypt had a complicated relationship. They traded, they fought, and they influenced each other for thousands of years. At times, Kush was an Egyptian colony, but at other times, Kush was the conqueror. During Egypt's 25th dynasty, it was a line of Kushite kings, the Black Pharaohs, who ruled all of Egypt, from Sudan to the Mediterranean. They saw themselves not as foreigners, but as restorers of true Egyptian tradition, even after being pushed out of Egypt by the Assyrians. Kush didn't just survive, it thrived. Its capital shifted south to the city of Meroe, a bustling hub for trade routes connecting the African interior, the Red Sea, and the Nile. Meroe was a city of industry. Archaeologists have found massive piles of slag there, leftovers from a huge iron-smelting industry that earned it the nickname, the Birmingham of ancient Africa. The kingdom controlled the trade in gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animal skins. It was fabulously wealthy. The landscape around Meroe was dotted with their own unique style of pyramids, smaller, steeper, and more numerous than the ones in Egypt. They had their own language, Meroitic, which is still not fully understood today, a silent reminder of their distinct identity. And critically, Kush's political structure was different. While it had kings, real power was often held by a line of formidable ruling queens. Their title was Kandake, which Greek and Roman writers corrupted into Candace. These weren't just wives of kings. They were often rulers in their own right, commanders of armies. Some scholars believe the throne often passed through the female line, giving these women an authority almost unheard of in the patriarchal worlds of Greece and Rome, though the exact rules are still debated by historians. This was the kingdom the Romans found on their new southern border. Not a collection of scattered tribes, but an ancient, wealthy, and proud civilization. For centuries, the Egyptians had called Kush the Southern Thorn, a challenge they could never quite crush. Now, as Rome stepped into Egypt's sandals, they were about to feel that thorn for themselves. The clash between Rome and Kush was basically inevitable. When the first Roman governor of Egypt, Cornelius Gallus, showed up in 30 BC, he brought the standard Roman playbook. For Rome, borders were just suggestions, lines to be redrawn ever forward. To them, Kush was simply what's next. Gallus immediately marched south to the traditional border at the first cataract of the Nile. He crushed a local revolt, established Roman garrisons, and essentially annexed a strip of land the Kushites considered theirs. Then came the ultimate insult: taxes. The Romans demanded tribute from the people in these borderlands. To the rulers in Meroe, this was completely unacceptable. They were the dominant power here, not some client state about to be bled dry. The Roman attitude was pure arrogance. They saw the Kushites as primitive barbarians, an attitude reflected in the writings of the Greek geographer Strabo, who, despite his bias, gives us one of the most detailed accounts of the war. This underestimation was Rome's first and biggest mistake. And this is where she enters the story, the woman who would become the face of Kushite resistance, Candace Amanirenas. We don't know much about her early life, because her kingdom's script is still a puzzle. But we know what the Romans thought of her. Strabo described her as a masculine sort of woman, and blind in one eye. This was probably meant as a jab in a culture that idolized physical perfection. But today, it paints a picture of a battle-hardened warrior queen. That lost eye wasn't a flaw, it was a resume. It meant she led from the front. Amanirenas was the ruling queen, likely governing in her own right alongside her son, Prince Akinadad. She saw the Roman garrisons creeping south and heard the demands for tribute. She knew what was coming. The Romans had just swallowed Egypt. Kush was the logical next course. The choice was simple. They could bow, pay the taxes, and watch their kingdom get dismantled and absorbed into the Roman machine. They could become just another conquered people, or they could fight. They could remind this new empire from the north exactly who they were messing with. The decision was made. In 25 BC, the Roman governor of Egypt, Aelius Gallus, was conveniently distracted, leading a disastrous expedition into modern-day Yemen. The Roman garrisons in the south were stretched thin. Amanirenas saw her chance. This wouldn't be a simple raid. This was going to be a full-scale invasion, a calculated counterpunch designed to send a message all the way back to the emperor in Rome. The Lioness of Meroe was about to strike. Kron. In 25 BC, with the main Roman force sweating in the Arabian desert, the Candace unleashed her army. An estimated 30,000 Kushite warriors, led by Queen Amanirenas and her son Akinadad, surged north. They fell on the unprepared Roman outposts with shocking speed. The frontier cities of Syene, Elephantine, and Phalae, which the Romans had fortified to anchor their southern border, were overwhelmed. The small Roman garrisons didn't stand a chance. The Kushites sacked the cities, took prisoners, and began systematically tearing down the symbols of Roman power. But this was more than just a military campaign. It was psychological warfare, and it all climaxed with one legendary act of defiance. Across the empire, statues of Emperor Augustus were everywhere. They weren't just art, they were symbols of his divine authority, the embodiment of Rome itself. To damage one was treason. During the sack of one of the cities, Kushite soldiers captured a magnificent bronze statue of Augustus. They didn't just smash it. In a stroke of genius, they beheaded it. They then carried that bronze head with its calm, godlike expression over 600 miles south to their capital, Meroe. And they didn't put it in a treasure room. They did something far more humiliating. They buried it right under the steps of a temple. Based on the archaeology, this temple seems to have been dedicated to victory. The Meroe head, as it's now called, was placed so that every single person who entered that temple would literally and symbolically trample on the face of the Roman emperor. It was the ultimate gesture of contempt. Every day, the people of Meroe walked over the image of the man who called himself a living god. This incredible story was just a story until 1910, when British archaeologists excavating Meroe, today it sits in the British Museum, its calm glass eyes staring out of a past that Rome wanted to forget. It's the single most powerful piece of evidence for this incredible story. News of the invasion sent panic through the Roman administration. This was a catastrophe. The southern frontier hadn't just been breached, it had collapsed. Roman cities were occupied, and the emperor himself had been subjected to a deeply personal insult. Lurid legends even began to spread, with some popular tales, almost certainly Roman propaganda, claiming Amanera Nice fed Roman captives to her pet lions. For Augustus, this was intolerable. He had just sold himself to the world as the great restorer of peace and order. He couldn't let an African queen get the better of him. The humiliation was too great. The full might of the Roman Empire was about to turn south. The lioness had landed a powerful blow, but now the eagle was coming for revenge. The emperor's response was swift and brutal. Augustus recalled the governor from his failed Arabian adventure and sent in a new man, Gaius Petronius. Petronius was a ruthless military commander, a fixer. His orders were simple: crush the Kushites, restore Roman honor, and secure that border for good. Petronius gathered a force of around 10,000 legionaries plus auxiliaries. This was a huge chunk of the Roman army in Egypt, a clear sign of how seriously Augustus was taking this. In 24 BC, Petronius marched south with one thing on his mind: vengeance. In a head-to-head battle, the odds were stacked against Kush. While the Kushite soldiers were brave, many fought with simpler weapons and shields made of oxhide. They were no match for the steel and discipline of a Roman legion in open combat. The two armies clashed near the city of Pselcis, and despite being outnumbered, Petronius's legions won the day. The Kushite army was forced to retreat, but Petronius wasn't just there to push them back. He was there to punish them. The Roman army chased the retreating Kushites deep into Nubia. He retook the town of Premnis, modern Qasr Ibrim, and pushed the Roman frontier further south than ever before. His ultimate target was Napata, the old capital of Kush, and its most sacred religious center. After a grueling march, the Romans sacked the city. They burned much of it to the ground, enslaved its people, and looted its temples. It's believed that Prince Akinadad was killed in the fighting. To Petronius, this must have felt like a textbook Roman victory. He'd beaten the enemy, retaken territory, and destroyed one of their most important cities. He probably thought he had broken the will of the Kushites and taught their one-eyed queen a lesson. He left a garrison behind and headed back to Alexandria, confident the war was won. He could not have been more wrong. The destruction of Napata was a serious blow, but it didn't destroy the Kingdom of Kush. The real capital was now Meroe, further south and much harder to reach. The sacking of a holy city didn't cripple the state, and it definitely didn't cripple the Kandake's will to fight. Instead of begging for peace, Amanirenas regrouped. She knew she couldn't beat the legions in a straight fight. So, she changed the rules of the game. Her forces began a campaign of relentless guerrilla warfare. The Kushites knew the land, the deserts, the hidden wells, the winding river paths. The Romans were strangers in a hostile country. Roman supply lines were now stretched dangerously thin. Kushite raiding parties would melt out of the desert, hit Roman patrols and convoys, and vanish back into the sands. The Roman war machine was built for decisive battles, not for being bled dry by 1,000 cuts in a country it couldn't control. Petronius realized that while he could win battles, he couldn't win the war. Actually conquering Kush would be a logistical nightmare, a sinkhole for men and money, with little strategic gain. Meroe, the real prize, was still untouchable. The victory at Napata was starting to look hollow. Then, in 22 BC, Amanirenas proved her fight was far from over. She gathered another army and marched north, laying siege to the new Roman fort at Premnis, trapping the garrison inside. Petronius had to rush south all over again to save them. It was now clear to both sides. This was an unwinnable war. Rome couldn't conquer Kush, and Kush couldn't permanently drive Rome out. The great Roman war machine had been fought to a standstill. The time for fighting was over. The time for talking was about to begin. The bloody stalemate led to a conclusion that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Rome had to negotiate, and the Kushites weren't coming to the table as a defeated people. They were coming as a power that had earned respect. In an incredible display of confidence, Candace Amanirenas sent her ambassadors not to the local governor, but directly to the emperor himself. In 21 BC, Augustus was on the Greek island of Samos, and it was there that the Kushite delegation arrived to meet the most powerful man in the world. Imagine that scene. Ambassadors representing a one-eyed warrior queen, standing before the emperor, whose statue they had decapitated and buried under a temple. The ancient writer Strabo tells us they came with a bundle of golden arrows. The message they carried was just as sharp. They reportedly told Augustus that the arrows were a gift from the Candace. If he wanted peace, they were a symbol of her friendship. If he wanted war, he should keep them, because he was going to need them. Augustus was a pragmatist. He knew a bad deal when he saw one. The war in Kush was a costly, unwinnable mess. His real focus was the dangerous border with the Parthian Empire in the east. He needed Egypt, his personal piggy bank, to be stable. A forever war in Nubia was a threat to that stability. It was better to cut his losses and make peace, humiliation or not. And so, on the island of Samos, one of the most remarkable peace agreements in Roman history was reached. The terms were astonishingly good for Kush. First, Rome agreed to pull all of its forces out of the contested Kushite territory, abandoning the forts they had just established. They pulled their border back north. Second, and this is the kicker, Augustus canceled all demands for tribute. The Kingdom of Kush would not have to pay a single coin in taxes to Rome. This was a stunning reversal. Rome built its empire on tribute from conquered lands. For an emperor to not only fail to conquer a nation, but to then grant it an exemption from the very taxes that started the war was a quiet but massive admission that Rome had not won. Kush's sovereignty was formally recognized. Rome had met its match. The Treaty of Samos kicked off a long period of peace and trade between the two powers, but as equals, not as conqueror and subject. So why isn't this incredible story of an African queen who took on the Roman Empire and won a household name? Why don't we talk about Amanirenas the way we talk about other figures who challenged Rome, like Boudicca or Spartacus, who were ultimately crushed? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to who gets to write history. For centuries, the narrative has been overwhelmingly Eurocentric, focused on Greece and Rome. In that story, Africa was often pushed to the margins, its civilization seen only through the lens of their neighbors. Early historians often dismissed Kush's achievements as just borrowed from Egypt, failing to see its unique and powerful identity. The story of Amanirenas completely upends that neat, Rome-centric narrative. It presents a powerful African kingdom that refused to fall. It features a female leader who out-generaled and outmaneuvered Roman commanders, a fact that was probably uncomfortable for patriarchal Roman historians to dwell on. Strabo calling her masculine is a perfect example of this bias. It was easier to downplay the conflict, frame Petronius's campaign as a simple success, and just quietly forget the humiliating terms of the peace deal. But the evidence, from the bronze head under the temple floor to the treaty terms recorded by Strabo himself, tells the real story. The legacy of this resistance is profound. The peace treaty helped secure Kush's independence for centuries. While Rome kept expanding elsewhere, its southern border in Africa remained fixed. Kush flourished, continuing its vibrant trade and developing its unique culture. The legacy of Candace Amanirenas is one of brilliant and successful leadership. She inherited a kingdom on the verge of being swallowed by a superpower. Through a smart mix of military force, strategic defense, and shrewd diplomacy, she not only saved her nation, but secured a lasting and favorable peace. Her story, long buried in the sands of Sudan and in the footnotes of biased histories, is a vital chapter in the story of Africa and the world. History remembers Rome's might, but it tends to forget those who refuse to bow. The Kingdom of Kush, led by the one-eyed Candace Amanirenas, didn't just fight Rome. They fought Rome to a standstill, humbled its emperor, and won the peace. Their victory isn't just a forgotten piece of history, it's a powerful reminder that history is full of unsung heroes and unbowed kingdoms if we just care enough to look. While Kush challenged Rome on its southern frontier, another African kingdom had a far more tangled history with the Republic. They were allies, then rivals, and finally the cause of a frustrating war that exposed the corruption, eating away at Rome's heart. Next we turn to Numidia, the kingdom of the horse lords, and the story of a king who used Rome's own tactics against it. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you first have to appreciate the height of the alliance. The story really begins with one man, Massinissa. Born around 238 BC, he was the son of a chieftain of the Massili, one of two major Numidian tribal groups. He was raised in Carthage, educated in its ways, and even fought for them against Rome and Spain. He was a product of a complex world dominated by the pull of the great city of Carthage. The Numidians themselves were a Berber people, a collection of semi-nomadic tribes, famous for one thing above all else, their horsemanship. Ancient writers describe them with a mix of awe and fear. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, living on their horses, covering vast distances on minimal resources. Their signature tactic was to ride in, unleash a volley of javelins with deadly accuracy, and then pretend to retreat, luring overconfident enemies into a chaotic pursuit where they could be picked off and destroyed. During the Second Punic War, Rome learned about this cavalry the hard way. Hannibal's Numidian mercenaries were a constant thorn in their side, disrupting supply lines, scouting, and playing a key role in his greatest victories, like the Battle of Cannae. The Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, realized that to beat Hannibal, he had to turn Carthage's greatest weapon against them. He needed his own Numidians. His chance came from the shifting loyalties of the Numidian princes. The two main tribes, the Massili in the east and the Massiceli in the west, were bitter rivals. Massinissa of the Massili was initially allied with Carthage, while Syphax of the Massiceli had sided with Rome. But Carthaginian politics were a snake pit. They broke a promise to marry Massinissa to the Carthaginian noblewoman Sophonisba, and instead gave her to Syphax to seal a new alliance. This personal insult, combined with Scipio's strategic moves and a smart guess about the war's outcome, pushed Massinissa into the Roman camp around 2006 BC. It was the turning point. When Scipio invaded Africa in 24 BC, Massinissa joined him, and his local knowledge and loyal horsemen were priceless. He helped win a crushing victory at the Battle of the Great Plains, which led to the capture of his rival, Syphax. The final showdown came at Zama in 2020 BC, while Hannibal's infantry and war elephants fought fiercely against Scipio's legions. The battle was won on the wings. Massinissa, leading his cavalry alongside the Roman horsemen, routed the Carthaginian cavalry, and then circled back to slam into the rear of Hannibal's veteran infantry. The encirclement was complete. Hannibal's army was annihilated, and Carthage had to sue for peace. Rome was generous in its support. Massinissa wasn't just restored to his father's lands. He was recognized as king of a newly unified Numidia, which now included the territory of his old rival, Syphax. This served two purposes. First, it was a reward for a key ally whose help had been decisive. Second, and more importantly for Roman strategy, it created a permanent check on Carthaginian power. The peace treaty of 2000 BC specifically forbade Carthage from waging war without Roman permission. This basically gave Massinissa a free hand to nibble away at Carthaginian territory, which he did for the next 50 years, knowing Rome would likely back him up. Under Massinissa's long and stable reign, Numidia was transformed. He was much more than a warrior king. He was a nation builder. Using the farming techniques he'd learned in Carthage, he began settling his nomadic people. He encouraged them to take up agriculture, turning vast stretches of pastoral land into a productive breadbasket that even exported grain to Rome. He founded cities, minted his own currency, and fostered a distinct Numidian identity. He ruled for over 50 years, living to be 90, and was said to have fathered his last son at 86. He remained a loyal and unwavering ally of Rome until his death, the perfect friendly king who served Roman interests while building his own power. But there were already signs of trouble. As Massinissa's kingdom grew richer and more powerful, some in Rome began to watch with unease. Was their loyal ally becoming too powerful? The relationship was one of patronage. But the patron always expects the client to stay subordinate. Rome had helped create the conditions for Numidia's rise, and it expected Numidia to remember its place. On his death in 1408 BC, just as the Third Punic War was beginning, a war Massinissa himself had helped provoke, the Romans intervened in the succession. Instead of letting a single powerful ruler inherit the kingdom, they advised that it be divided among his 3 legitimate sons. It was a clear signal that Rome, not the Numidian royal house, was the ultimate arbiter of power in North Africa. The golden age of the alliance was over. The stage was being set for the first act of the betrayal. Massinissa's death marked a subtle but deep shift in the Roman-Numidian relationship. The generation of Scipio and Massinissa, bound by shared battles and mutual respect, was gone. The new generation of Roman senators saw Numidia less as a partner and more as a problem to be managed. Dividing the kingdom among Massinissa's sons, Micipsa, Gulussa, and Mestannabal, was a classic Roman divide-and-rule strategy. Although Micipsa eventually outlived his brothers and reunited the kingdom, the message was clear: Numidian sovereignty was conditional on Roman approval. The real trouble, though, started with the next generation. Micipsa had 2 sons, Adherbal and Haimsal, but he also had an illegitimate nephew, the son of his brother Mestannabal, a young man named Jugurtha. Jugurtha was charismatic, intelligent, tough, and had limitless ambition, everything a Roman aristocrat might claim to admire. He was a master of the traditional Numidian skills of riding and fighting. Micipsa, seeing both the young man's talent and the threat he posed to his own sons, adopted him. Then he made a fateful decision, hoping it would either get Jugurtha killed or at least tame him. He sent him to Spain to serve with the Roman army at the siege of Numantia in 1330 BC. This was like sending a promising executive to the company's toughest overseas post. At Numantia, Jugurtha served under Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus. And he didn't just serve, he thrived. He fought with incredible bravery, impressed Roman commanders with his discipline and strategic mind, and most importantly, he learned how Rome worked. He saw the virtues of Roman military organization, but he also saw its vices. He made friends with powerful young Roman nobles, and he learned a lesson that would define his career. The Roman historian Sallust, our main source for this story, claims these new friends were the ones who first whispered that he should seize the kingdom for himself, telling him that in Rome, all things were for sale. When Jugurtha returned to Numidia, he was no longer just a promising prince. He was a war hero with a network of powerful Roman contacts. The aging Micipsa, probably seeing the writing on the wall, made him a joint heir to the kingdom alongside his own 2 sons. It was a recipe for disaster. As soon as Micipsa died in 1118 BC, the fragile arrangement shattered. Jugurtha, driven by ambition and his contempt for his cousins, made his move. He allegedly had the hot-headed Haimsal assassinated. The other brother, Adherbal, feared for his life and fled to the one place he thought he could find justice, Rome. He appealed to the Senate, reminding them of the long, loyal friendship between Numidia and the Republic. This was the first big test of Rome's commitment. Adherbal presented his case as a simple matter of right and wrong. He was the legitimate heir. His brother had been murdered, and a usurper was trying to steal the kingdom. Jugurtha, however, didn't send a plea for justice. He sent envoys carrying bags of gold. His time in Spain had taught him well. He activated his network, and money flowed freely into the pockets of influential senators. The Roman Senate, which should have acted decisively to protect the legitimate heir of a client king, was paralyzed by corruption. Instead of punishing Jugurtha, the Senate did what compromise committees always do. They formed a commission. A 10-man delegation was sent to North Africa in 1116 BC to divide Numidia between the 2 claimants. The commission, widely accused of being bribed, awarded Jugurtha the western half of the kingdom. Adherbal was left with the eastern part, which included the capital city of Cirta. According to Sallust's account, Jugurtha's portion was the more prosperous and developed of the 2, though this is a point of historical debate. Rome hadn't just failed to punish a murderer, it had rewarded him. The message sent to North Africa was unmistakable. Roman justice was for sale, and loyalty was a currency that was quickly losing its value. Jugurtha, now legitimized by a Roman decree, had learned a dangerous lesson. Roman power could be neutralized, even manipulated, with bribes. He had tested the system and found it hollow. For Hannibal, the lesson was much more bitter. He had put his faith in Rome's honor and been betrayed. He was left with a smaller state, facing a ruthless rival who now had the quiet approval of their supposed protector. The seeds of discord, sown by Jugurtha's ambition and watered by Roman corruption, were about to bear bloody fruit. The war that followed wasn't just for control of Numidia, it would become a trial for the decaying soul of the Roman Republic itself. The Senate's compromise decision didn't bring peace to Numidia, it just postponed the inevitable. Jugurtha, emboldened by his success, saw the division of the kingdom as a temporary inconvenience. His goal wasn't half a kingdom, but all of it. He spent the next few years building his army and preparing. In 1113 BC, he launched an all-out invasion of Hannibal's territory. Hannibal was defeated in open battle and retreated to his last stronghold, the heavily fortified capital of Cirta. The city wasn't just defended by Numidians. A large community of Italian and Roman merchants had settled there during the long years of peace, and these men, confident in their Roman status, actively helped defend the city, believing Jugurtha wouldn't dare harm them. Besieged and desperate, Hannibal sent another urgent plea to the Senate, smuggling a letter out of the city that begged for military intervention. And once again, the Senate dithered. Envoys were sent, but Jugurtha, now an expert at the Roman game, simply stalled them with drawn-out negotiations while tightening the siege. He knew the wheels of Roman politics turned slowly, and many of those wheels were greased with his gold. The siege dragged on. Finally, the Italian defenders inside Cirta, facing starvation, persuaded Hannibal to surrender. They trusted that their Roman status would guarantee their safety and the king's. It was a fatal miscalculation. Once the gates of Cirta opened in 1112 BC, Jugurtha showed just how ruthless he could be. He had Hannibal executed, likely after being tortured, but he didn't stop there. In a shocking act of defiance, he also massacred the adult male Italian merchants who had helped defend the city. This was a direct challenge that even the most corrupt Roman senator couldn't ignore. Killing a client king was one thing, but slaughtering Roman citizens and allies was an insult to the power and prestige of Rome itself. Public outrage in Rome, fanned by political rivals of the corrupt elite, was immense. The Senate had no choice. War was declared, but the opening stages of the Jugurthan War were a showcase of incompetence and corruption, further exposing the rot at the heart of the Republic. The first Roman commander, the consul Lucius Calpurnius Bestia, started off well, but then suddenly negotiated a peace treaty with Jugurtha on suspiciously generous terms. The accusations of bribery were so loud that the treaty was thrown out, and Bestia was recalled to face an investigation. Jugurtha himself was then summoned to Rome under a promise of safe conduct to testify about the bribery. Even in the heart of his enemy's capital, Jugurtha acted with incredible nerve. He bribed a tribune to veto his public testimony, effectively silencing the investigation. And while he was there, he arranged the assassination of another Numidian cousin, Maefa, who was living in Rome and posed a threat to his throne. This brazen murder inside the city walls was the final straw. His safe conduct was revoked, and he was kicked out of Italy. As he left, the historian Sallust has him looking back at the city and delivering his famous judgment: "O venal city, and soon to perish if you find a buyer." The war resumed, but Rome's fortunes didn't improve. In 1110 BC, another Roman army was ambushed, and not just defeated, but humiliated. They were forced to pass under the yoke, a ritual of submission, where the defeated soldiers had to walk under a spear held up by their conquerors. The disgrace echoed throughout the Roman world. The war had become a national embarrassment. Jugurtha, the king of a second-rate power, was running circles around Rome's legions, not just with brilliant guerrilla tactics, but by exploiting the moral bankruptcy of its leaders. The conflict had laid bare a deep sickness in Rome. It showed that the old republican virtues of honor and duty were being choked out by greed. The people of Rome were furious, and they began to look for a new kind of leader, a new man who could restore Rome's honor and end this humiliating war. They would find him in a brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless soldier who had been serving as a subordinate in Africa, a man named Gaius Marius. The war against Jugurtha was about to enter a new and much more brutal phase. Before we continue with the rise of Marius and the final, brutal chapter in Numidia's story, I want to take a moment to thank you for watching. These deep dives into history are made possible by your support. If you're enjoying this exploration of Roman power politics and the tragic tale of their betrayed ally, please take a moment to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss our future documentaries. Now, back to the sun-scorched plains of Numidia, where a new Roman general is about to change everything. The repeated humiliations in Numidia created a political firestorm back in Rome. The people were furious, and the Senate's authority was in tatters. This crisis paved the way for the rise of Gaius Marius. Marius was a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family to be elected consul, an office almost exclusively held by a small circle of aristocrats. He was blunt, ambitious, and had built a reputation as a tough and able officer under the command of Quintus Caecilius Metellus, the general who had taken over after the earlier disasters. Metellus had actually been making slow but steady progress, waging a more methodical campaign. He won several battles, but just couldn't pin down the elusive Jugurtha, who had switched back to the guerrilla warfare his people did so well. Marius, serving as Metellus' second-in-command, grew impatient. He saw the war as his shot at greatness, undermining his own commander. He returned to Rome, and campaigning on a promise to end the corrupt aristocratic mismanagement of the war, was overwhelmingly elected consul for 107 BC. In a revolutionary move, the popular assembly also voted to give him the command in Numidia, bypassing the Senate entirely. Marius's first act was to fundamentally reform the army itself. Traditionally, legions were recruited from land-owning citizens. Marius, needing more men for a grinding war, opened recruitment to the Capicensi, the landless poor of Rome. He promised them pay, a share of the spoils and land when they retired. This single act had monumental consequences, transforming the Roman army from a citizen militia into a professional force whose loyalty was to the general who paid them, not the state. It created the client armies that would eventually march on Rome itself. But in the short term, it gave Marius a large, motivated force to finish the job in Africa. Arriving in Numidia, Marius prosecuted the war with a new level of ferocity. He wasn't interested in a slow grind. He aimed to break the will of the Numidians. He relentlessly hunted Jugurtha's forces, conquered his remaining strongholds, and used terror tactics, like the massacre at the city of Capsa, to intimidate anyone who might support the king. Yet Jugurtha himself remained at large. No matter how many battles Marius won, Jugurtha, with his intimate knowledge of the terrain, always managed to escape, melting away into the desert to raise a new force. He was a ghost the Roman legions just couldn't catch. Jugurtha's final hope was an alliance with his father-in-law, King Bocchus I of Mauritania, the kingdom to the west. Together, their combined forces launched a major attack on Marius's army as it marched to its winter quarters. The Romans were nearly overwhelmed, but Marius's tactical skill and the discipline of his new legions held them together, and they eventually fought off the attack. Still, it became clear to Marius that as long as Jugurtha had allies and a place to run, the war might never end by military means alone. The key to victory wasn't on the battlefield, it was in diplomacy and betrayal. And here, another ambitious Roman entered the story: Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was Marius's questor, a junior officer from a noble but poor family. He was the opposite of Marius in many ways, aristocratic, cultured and subtle, and a bitter rivalry was already brewing between them. Sulla was sent to the court of King Bocchus to negotiate. It was an incredibly dangerous mission. Sulla, using a mix of threats and promises, offering Bocchus a formal alliance with Rome and a piece of Numidian territory, slowly convinced the Mauritanian king that his future lay with Rome, not with his fugitive son-in-law. Bocchus was caught between family loyalty and the overwhelming power of the Roman war machine. He made his choice. A trap was laid. Jugurtha was lured to a conference, supposedly to discuss peace terms. There, he was ambushed and handed over in chains to Sulla in 1005 BC. The war was over. Jugurtha, the man who had defied Rome for 7 years, was finally a captive. He was dragged back to Rome and paraded through the streets in Marius's triumphal procession in 1004 BC. Afterward, he was thrown into the Tullianum, Rome's subterranean prison. Ancient sources say he was either strangled or left to starve to death in the cold darkness. A grim end to his audacious life. Jugurtha's capture was a major victory, but it also sowed the seeds of a future civil war. Sulla, having personally secured the capture, took much of the credit, even having a signet ring engraved with the scene of him receiving Jugurtha from Bacchus. Marius, as the commanding general, celebrated the triumph and reaped the political rewards, but he deeply resented Sulla's claim to the glory. The Jugurthine War hadn't just exposed the corruption of the old guard, it had created the two titans, whose rivalry would soon drench Rome in blood. For Numidia, the end of the war brought a temporary reprieve, but the kingdom was now diminished and firmly under the Roman thumb. Rome had shown it would not tolerate a truly independent power in North Africa. The final betrayal was yet to come, but its script had been written. The end of the Jugurthine War marked the end of any pretense of a partnership. Numidia was no longer an equal ally. It was a subjugated territory. While it wasn't immediately annexed, its fate was now entirely in Roman hands. A chunk of western Numidia was given to King Bacchus of Mauritania as a reward for betraying Jugurthy. The rest of the kingdom was given to Goda, Jugurtha's weak half-brother, ensuring the new Numidian ruler would be a compliant puppet. The once proud kingdom of Massinissa was now a fractured, diminished state, whose rulers served at Rome's pleasure. For the next 50 years, Numidia existed in this political limbo. Its kings still ruled and fielded their own armies, but they did so under the watchful eye of the Roman governor next door. They were kings in name, but vassals in reality. This arrangement suited Roman interests, providing security and resources without the headache of direct rule. The final act in Numidia's story came during the next great upheaval to shake the Roman world, the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Like all of Rome's client states, the Numidian king was forced to choose a side in a fight that wasn't his own. The choice would be fatal. The king of Numidia at this time was Juba I. His father had been restored to his throne by Pompey, so Juba was a staunch supporter of the Pompeian cause. He also had a personal grudge against Caesar. Years earlier, during a visit to Rome, Caesar had apparently insulted Juba by pulling his beard during a legal dispute. So for Juba, the choice was clear. He threw his considerable resources, including his famous cavalry and war elephants, behind the Pompeians. In the early stages of the African campaign, Juba was a formidable opponent. In 49 BC, his forces, fighting alongside the Pompeian commander, Attius Varus, ambushed and annihilated a Roman army led by Caesar's lieutenant, Gaius Scribonius Curio. The victory bolstered the Pompeian cause in Africa and made Juba a key player in the anti-Caesarian faction. But when Caesar himself landed in Africa in 46 BC, the situation changed dramatically. Caesar was a military genius. The forces against him were a tough collection of Roman veterans and allied troops, with Juba's Numidian army as a crucial component. But Juba made a critical error. While he marched to join the main Pompeian army, his own kingdom was invaded from the west by Bacchus II of Mauritania, now Caesar's ally, and a Roman adventurer named Publius Sittius. Juba had to divert a large part of his army to defend his homeland, weakening the main Pompeian force at the worst possible moment. He rejoined the Pompeians just in time for the final confrontation, the Battle of Thapsus in April 46 BC. The battle was a disaster for the Pompeian side. Caesar's generalship was superior, and his legions crushed them. Juba's war elephants, which were supposed to be a key weapon, panicked and trampled their own lines. For Juba, there was no escape. Defeated on the battlefield, and with his kingdom being overrun, he fled, but his own cities refused to let him in. He was a king without a kingdom. According to the historian Appian, Juba and the Roman general Marcus Petreius, seeing their situation was hopeless, agreed to a suicide pact. They fought a one-on-one duel, where Juba killed the Roman before falling on his own sword. It was a tragic, warrior's end for the last independent king of Numidia. With Juba's death, Numidia's independence was extinguished forever. Caesar showed no sentimentality. he annexed its eastern territories, creating a new Roman province called Africa Nova, New Africa. The once great kingdom of Massinissa was now just another piece of Roman real estate. In an ironic twist, the historian Sallust, who chronicled the Jugurthine War, was appointed its first governor and proceeded to get rich at the province's expense. The absorption of the kingdom was a piecemeal process, with western parts passing to others like Bocchus II before eventually being integrated into the Roman system. The name Numidia didn't vanish entirely from the map overnight, but its existence as an independent power was over. The son of Juba, a young boy also named Juba, was taken to Rome and raised as a Roman. In a strange twist of fate, this Juba II would become one of the most learned and respected client kings of the next generation. But he would rule over Mauritania, not the Numidian kingdom of his ancestors. The story of Numidia was finished. The stories of Carthage, Kush, and Numidia show us a Roman history that's far more complex than a simple story of conquest. These weren't just minor setbacks for Rome. They were profound challenges that shaped its destiny. Carthage, the rival superpower, brought the Republic to the verge of collapse. Hannibal's genius tested Rome's resilience to its absolute limit, and the fear he inspired was a permanent reminder that they were not invincible. The Kingdom of Kush, under the defiant Queen Amenarines, proved that even the personal authority of an emperor was not absolute. Her campaign was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare that secured a peace based on respect and sovereignty, a rare feat for any power that stood against Rome. And Numidia, under the cunning King Jugurtha, exposed the internal fragility of the Roman Republic. His war was fought not just with javelins, but with bribery and an intimate knowledge of his enemy's corruption, accelerating the political crises that would eventually lead to the Republic's downfall. Together, these three African powers are a powerful reminder that Rome's path to dominance was fiercely contested. They showed the world that Africa was a continent of great powers, sophisticated strategies, and legendary leaders. Their stories deserve to be remembered as proof that no empire is all-powerful, and that the courage to resist can change the course of history. What do you think was Rome's greatest challenge? Was it Hannibal's military genius, Amenarines' bold resistance, or Jugurtha's clever manipulation? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this look at a different side of history, please hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more stories that challenge the narratives we think we know. Thanks for watching.